So, Ishin Kiwami has been around for a month now, and the reception it garnered is fairly mixed. Most newcomers absolutely adored the approach it took, while people who played the original game felt like it made a few missteps. Essentially, it's what you'd expect from a Kiwami title by now. Personally, I'm enjoying my time with the game quite a bit, and I'm currently working on a proper review to release down the line. Having said that, once I reached the topic of Ishin's DLC, that segment ballooned into a fully fledged discussion on its own. And it's a topic that really needs to be addressed, as it pertains to issues that are far greater than we give them credit for. If you clicked on this video expecting me to rant on RGG or SEGA as a whole, or even call them sellouts, then you're in the wrong place. Cause even though my thoughts on the DLC are mixed, the real issue is the precedent it may set down the line. To start off, let's take a look at what makes Ishin's DLC a hot topic. There are many packs available, ranging from disposable items intended to improve your weapons, to general cosmetics, and even exclusive content only obtainable through paying. The thing that drew the most ire isn't necessarily the content that is being sold, but rather the process of obtaining it. In order to store the items you purchased, you're forced to save the game immediately. So let's say you use one of those items by accident and you want to reload your save file to mitigate that. Your item will still be gone. This specifically relates to the disposable items like upgrade stones and crafting materials, but the problem is that similar DLC incentives were present in the other Yakuza games, yet they didn't have this strange restriction on their use. Hell, you could even use them all over again upon entering New Game Plus, making them much more than mere pre-order incentives. While I think this particular incentive was poorly implemented in Ishin, I'd even be willing to chalk it up to trappings of the system it is developed around. Ishin was the first game in the franchise that genuinely had crafting as a natural and integral part of your story playthrough. And when you're trying to present a game as inherently being beginner-friendly, you'll want to offer a shortcut for the newcomers who just don't want to deal with the intended grind. But the funniest thing about this particular DLC is the fact that it's genuinely worse than the other DLC which is offered for free. For some added context, if you've played Devil May Cry 5 upon release, you'll recall a similar controversy around the DLC that included in-game currency as one of the benefits you could get. But with the way that the game is actually balanced, the amount you'd get in the DLC is genuinely laughable, and could be obtained through just casually playing through the game with ease. Meaning that the DLC itself, which was probably just mandated by a certain higher-up, was simply there to tick a proverbial box, and not to actually strong-arm players into paying. And I feel that this very same logic applies to Ishin's material DLC as well. For example, one of the free DLCs you can get includes a number of legendary trooper cards, which will give you amazing stat upgrades even if you don't actively use the cards themselves. Not only that, but each console has access to a different unique DLC weapon, and its stats alone make the troublesome grind of the crafting system completely avoidable, as you'll easily be carried through most of the main game with just a basic sword. That's what happened with me when I got the water drop katana, for example. Now, while the shortcomings of this DLC may be glossed over, even with the flawed acquisition process, that courtesy isn't one I'd extend to the Dragon of Dojima costume and Ishin difficulty. Again, materials can be obtained through regular play if you want them, but the aforementioned cosmetic and difficulty setting are strictly locked behind the largest DLC package available. The introduction of these elements was a part of the initial development cycle and budget, meaning that they were always going to be taken out of the base release in order to mitigate increasing development costs. On one hand, this makes for a good call when talking about increasing revenue, but on the other hand, the community could see it as another intended misstep. Just remember the controversy behind the New Game Plus DLC that Yakuza 7's Japanese release was plagued by. It feels like we can no longer afford to make additional content outside of the allotted development time and offer a title some long-time support. That approach might work for fighting games like Tekken 7, or even a commercial Goliath like the Souls series, but not for Yakuza, because at the end of the day, despite the mainstream reach of Zero specifically, this is still an incredibly niche series. I get that it may not seem that way when you compare it to the early days in the West, But the Yakuza of today isn't trying to compete with its former self, but with every other game on the market. So, you have to resort to taking out already finished content to further incentivize early purchases and try to keep up. And I get why this would still anger people, because sinking to the low standards of the video game industry shouldn't be encouraged. But even with everything I just said about this implementation of DLC in Ishin, I still don't think this is RGG's fault. Hell, I wouldn't even say SEGA themselves made these choices out of any malicious intent. Allow me to share my observations as someone who has formally studied economics for a number of years. This business philosophy we're now experiencing is something that inevitably caught up to our favorite developer due to the climate of the video game industry in its entirety. When the lowest common denominator only cares about how shiny a game looks and how much numerical content it has compared to the previous release, you start treading into dangerous territory. We've reached a point where crunch culture and content being taken out and sold separately is seen as a fundamental management choice to turn a profit, or in some cases even to simply break even. While companies like EA like to push mechanics like loot boxes and microtransactions maliciously, other companies are forced to alter their business model just to finish a project on time and stay afloat. And the reason we got to this point is that developers are not given the required time and resources to contend with the ever-increasing workload and demands. This is the outcome of subscription services offering brand new games on release, therefore slashing profits from the most crucial point in a game's lifecycle. Sure, the subscription models are more beneficial to a consumer, but because of that, management can force ground floor developers to push for other ways of generating revenue to balance out the internal calculations. And before you know it, you'll wind up with dodgy DLC practices, games that are broken on release, and studios being shut down left and right because you can't physically keep up with all of these demands without something eventually breaking. I mean, it's literally what happened to the music industry. Subscription services made it so that artists can't make a living off of recorded music, but purely through merchandise and live concerts. And I'm not saying that it's the companies who made the actual subscription services that dealt the final blow here. Ironically, they just wind up diverting even more money to shareholders and the highest level of management instead of actually reinvesting it to future projects. And the worst part is that, on paper, this also allows them to significantly worsen current and future development cycles for the people who do the most work but are never fairly compensated for it. And it's driven to absolutely perverse levels when you see the utilized hierarchies in modern entrepreneurship. If you're in the AAA sphere, the deck is literally stacked against you. But let me be very clear when I say that SEGA is not like these other companies. And RGG sure as hell isn't like that either. I mean, just look more closely at all of the DLC we eventually got. For every seemingly malicious choice that was forced on them, you can see them desperately trying to mitigate those negatives. If you're mandated to make disposable materials akin to microtransactions, just develop a system that circumvents them for free. If your franchise is still too niche for the growing demands of the market, increase your fan base through collaborations. Just look at the people who are featured on the Trooper cards. While they're all undoubtedly Yakuza fans themselves, they're also fully established public figures in their own right. They can give the added push to the IP's fame and sales so that you're not forced to implement worse and worse DLC models over time. But no matter how hard they're trying to keep up their good intentions, there's only so much you can do when your competition just decides to sink to the lowest level to eventually drive you out of business. Just remember the fate of the beloved Dreamcast and how SEGA was forced to leave the console business. The industry is ruthless, and you don't need me to spell that out for you, because everything is overpriced and unfair these days. So it speaks volumes that within such a negative industry, the people working for SEGA have had nothing but praise about their actual work environment. I genuinely believe that they're still making these games first and foremost out of love. But how long can that really last today? If you don't speak up when the biggest names in the industry make terrible calls that are then forced onto everyone else to keep up with the competition, then we'll just wind up with more and more good people being overworked and leaving. And the seemingly tiny fee you used to pay to play hundreds of games will mirror the lack of care shown in future projects. which will then entirely devolve into shiny gambling simulators and not real memorable experiences. I don't want my favorite game franchises to devolve into fucking pachinko machines in 10 years' time. Something needs to change. Because if this keeps up, all we'll be left with are pained, distant memories of a time when things were better, and we'll all be to blame for it. If there's anything I'd like you to pick up from this video, is not to hate on RGG or anyone involved with these games, but just to make a conscious statement. Support the games and not the shady practices. If we collectively refuse to abide by microtransactions big or small in all of our favorite gaming franchises, the market as a whole will have to reshape. No microtransactions, no gacha, no patchy slot. Just games that are made to be games, not investments. I'd like to take this opportunity to apologize for the negative turn that this topic took, but this was something that was weighing on my mind for quite a while. In due time, I hope that this would just be remembered as a pessimist rant, as opposed to an ominous prophecy or whatever. At the very least, I promise that the following videos will be more uplifting, okay? Anyway, thank you for being here. My most sincere gratitude goes out to the amazing members who support this community and content. You're free to join if you so choose, but it's all completely optional. So, until next time, take care of yourselves and have a great day. Cheers!